Good afternoon, everyone. All right. So I'm really so happy to be here and to be moderating this panel on race and aesthetics. Well, I'll just sort of be pretty quick so we can just get right to the speakers. So first presenting will be Victoria Sung, who is Associate Curator of Visual Arts at the Walker Arts Center. Then will be Dorothy Wang, Professor and Chair. Sure. Dorothy Wang, Professor and Chair of American Studies at Williams College. Third will be Chitra Ganesh, Artist and Associate Professor of Painting at CUNY Hunter College. And last will be John Yao, Poet, Critic, and Professor of Critical Studies at Rutgers University. Just a reminder, there are full bios that are in the QR code in your program that are also listed online for more detailed information. So without further ado, let me bring out the panelists. And we'll begin first with Victoria Sung. And just a reminder, throughout, at the end of all the panels, I'll be giving a brief response, and afterwards we'll turn to Q&A. And we invite all of you to write questions on your postcards and to hand them to volunteers, so we'll be able to engage some of those questions throughout. So Victoria, why don't you get started?
All right, before I begin, I do want to thank Marcy, Elisa, Veronica, and everyone at the Stanford and Cantor Art Museum team for putting together this incredible symposium, and thank you so much for the invitation to participate. So we were all asked to choose a single image to speak to, and I conveniently found an image that allows me to talk about both an artist and an artwork. I chose this photograph of the late Filipina-American artist Pasita Abad, not because of its singularity, though it is striking, but because of its representativeness. Alongside this portrait, the artist's archive contains countless photographs where Abad poses with her artworks. But rather than blocking them from view, she seems to be subsumed by their material logics, engaging in an almost theatrical performance of the works themselves. In this and in other photos, using her body as a medium of visual expression, Abad enacts Trinity Minha's well-known concept of speaking nearby, as opposed to about other cultures. This photograph is from 1986 and was taken in advance of the Second Havana Biennial, which famously was the first time the biennial shifted its focus from Latin America and the Caribbean to include contributions from nearly 60 countries across the global south. Abad's contribution, depicted here, was made 3 years earlier, in 1983, following a trip to the Central African region that now comprises the Republic of the Congo and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is the first of a series of 8 large-scale masks, all of which are painted, stitched, and stuffed in a process akin to hand quilting that she called Bakongo. The Bakongo works resemble the 19th and 20th century Bifwebe face masks of the Songhai and Luba peoples, the striated angular lines of which crisscross the mask's carved surfaces. Abad's Bakongos deviate from their reference in their polychromatic vibrancy. Standing over 8 feet tall, the work flattens and extends the rounded form of the wooden mask into a high-frequency field of color. Abad stands proudly in front of Bakongo 1. The mask towers over her, its gaze looking off to the left, as if guarding her from evil spirits. Wearing a necklace from Palestine, ivory bracelets from Sudan, tin earrings from Kenya, and a necklace from Afghanistan, Abad stands with her outstretched arms, her palms facing upward. She is every inch the artist as modern-day shaman, the relaxed nature of her stance signaling her openness in what Margot Machida describes as alternate bodies of cultural knowledge. Just as the outline of the multicolored mask stands in relief against its black background, Abad seems to emerge from her black dress like an extension of the work itself. Clara Kim has written that the fuchsia and pale pink stripes that run down Abad's arms and the length of her body mirror the swaths of painted textile behind her. Similarly, her braided hair and beads mimic the technicolor patches that rhythmically dot the surface of the canvas. Abad and Bakongo 1 appear to be so thoroughly entwined that it becomes difficult to discern where one ends and the other begins. Over the course of her 32-year career, Abad traveled to more than 60 countries throughout Asia, Africa, Oceania, the Americas, and the Middle East, during which time she amassed an impressive collection of textiles. In addition to whole cloths, she sourced bits of printed and woven materials from different makers, cutting them into various shapes before slotting them into the plastic sleeves of her fabric scrapbooks. Tactile anthologies of global fabric traditions, her scrapbooks showcase a remarkable range of textile making techniques, many of which she learned by hand from the different artists and artisan communities she visited with, including Indonesian batik and Nigerian tie-dye. Unlike the conceptual art curator Sasigalab's contemporaneous bibliography of textile histories, which meticulously documents different fabric fragments and their social and economic histories, Abad's scrapbooks are improvised. And that was the point. Her textiles were intended to be used rather than preserved, lived with rather than archived. A single piece of fabric could find expression in her artwork on her body or in her home. Drawing on her embodied knowledge of different fiber traditions, Abad innovated a hybrid art form that she called trapunto painting, derived from the Italian word meaning to embroider, that importantly freed the canvas from stretcher and frame. We might think here about Faith Ringgold's story quilts, which, according to the artist, were inspired by seeing Tibetan thangkas, or scrolled paintings, at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In Abad's case, combining bits of cloth with beads from Indonesia, buttons from the Philippines, mirrors from India, and cowrie shells from Papua New Guinea, she practiced a defiant form of bricolage that Patrick Flores has described to me, tongue-in-cheek, as a work of a flaneur bricoleur. It is as if, unable to carry all the trinkets that she accumulated over the years on her petite frame, she decided to scatter them onto the receptive surfaces of her fabric paintings. I like to imagine that thousands of beads, buttons, shells, mirrors spill onto her enormous canvases, though that, of course, discounts the real labor that went into stitching every individual embellishment onto the fabric surface by hand. Through her art, Abad sought to replace colonialist paradigms of subjugation and assimilation with a vision of non-hierarchical, multidimensional, and complex unity. She felt kinship with the many artists and artisans she encountered on her travels, embracing and metabolizing local difference through her brown body as a Filipino woman. Artist Angel Velasco-Shaw has said that Abad inhaled other cultures, stitching them together consciously, unconsciously, intuitively in the making of her works. Trapunto then was more than an aesthetic decision. In Abad's insistence on fabric as painting, stitching as creative labor, and opacity as a form of resistance, she created art that in its very materiality and making collapsed such binary oppositions between fine art and craft, art and everyday life, center and periphery, and perhaps most relevant to this discussion, self and other. Thank you so much.
Okay, I don't think people can see that. Can you guys? Okay, I'm going to have to read it. Okay, hi everyone. I just wanted to say a big thank you to Marcy and Elisa and Eddie and everyone who's made this remarkable gathering possible. And I also want to give a special shout out to Gordon Chang, without whom my book would not have been published at Stanford. So we were asked to choose an image, and we were given the choice of choosing a poem as well as a visual piece. So I work on poetry, Asian American poetry and minority poetry. So I've picked a poem, but obviously it's hard to read. So I'm going to read it out loud. It's going to take up some of my time, but I think it'll help. I don't know how much you guys can see. So this is a poem called Grateful by an Asian American poet named Prageeta Sharma. And Sharma is, I'll just say a few words about her. She's written 5 books of poetry. She's originally from Massachusetts. She lived in Brooklyn for many years and then moved to the University of Montana, where she taught, and now she currently teaches at Pomona College. So let me read the poem, and then hopefully you'll be able to pick up some of it, so when I discuss it, you'll know what I'm talking about. So it's called Grateful. Having the desire or reason to thank somebody. Your poetry about outsiderness too outside the outlining norms It made you look ungrateful. Erosion of integrated feelings, a breakdown of the soft side, like bad, cheap bread. You could tell. People thought they ordered a baguette, but they got you. Bad, cheap bread, dressed with bad dressings, trying to taste good. Of the towardness you yearn for as though it were inclusion, and towardness is Towardness, of the towardness you yearn for as though it were inclusion, towardness replaced with something, not a collective, revolutionary, subjective empathy, no descriptive, abject space to share with others, the way you did in your urban environment, the way you used to follow and share abject feelings with others, with a kind of careful and mindful allegiance, if this is even possible. And now you become the descriptive, abject space, and you're horrified. On top of that, you find that everyone claims to be a Marxist, when really they're staunch constellations of teetering materialists. So when you are a glaring materialist with inner Marxist tendencies, you may appear tacky, but you are the outward of everyone's inward. It's all the same. There are attempts to stick you with the bill, to pat you with the so-so brush off, or you think everyone is a modernist, flashing the collective rejection of individual heroes, or limiting the play between subject and object to offerings of a specific alien play, tending to the tiny residual personal fires or shocks to the system. However, you're no fool. You realized all this very young. What t-shirt must you wear to convince them of this? A recess for adults leads to more shameless bullying, an articulation of disclusion. The patent expires on your wares. You're interested in a new contemporary musical scene. So I hope that was understandable. Okay, so I actually have more casual comments, and I really want to think about this poem by asking some questions, being a little bit polemical, but actually wanting to engage the audience. And I was hoping that people could see the poem so you all could actually participate in looking at it and thinking about it. So I want to argue that living within the structures and living ideologies of colonialism, we as BIPOC poets, artists, critics, and scholars must work within what in the poem says, the outlining norms of white supremacy and racial hierarchy, including, I would argue, the proper rhetorical stance. And I think in this case, I want to ask within the poem, but it would actually apply to artworks as well. What is the proper way to speak about race or racism, actually? What is the proper, again in quotation marks, rhetorical stance one must take? Is it different when you do it in a poem or an artwork than when you say something expositorily? So I was quoting from the poem. I mean, there are parts where I quote from the poem, but let me just ask the more general questions. So I'm interested in this issue of tone. I don't know if you caught when I read the poem, the kind of tone of this poem. And I think the title of the poem is called Grateful. So it really is about this kind of ironic, wry, disruptive view of what it means to be grateful. And I think this notion of what it means to be grateful is very, obviously very pertinent for BIPOC artists and writers. And for Asian Americans, one can argue the particular types of gratitude. And so I want us to think about that. And again, that question of tone, what kind of, how direct can one be when talking about white supremacy? Are there certain sorts of anger that certain types of expressions of anger that are actually acceptable? And one question for me would be, given the long and just deep history of African American poetic writing and African American literature, do we have within, say, Asian American poetry, or should we have actually, the equivalent of something like Amiri Baraka's Black art? Some of you may or may not know that, but Baraka was extremely in your face about certain things. And so, I mean, it's not to say one should or shouldn't, but the question of within, is there a certain expectation of how Asian American poets or artists should represent or speak? And of course, I make a distinction between the poet and the speaker. They're not the same thing. The speaker of this poem is not Pragita Sharma, it's the poetic speaker. So because I think that even if we think that we do not imagine, or when a poet writes a poem, they say they may not imagine a white reader, I do think that often internalized is the desire to please a white critic. And that's certainly true for artists, not just poets. So in that way, to please the critic would be, and I'm going to refer to the poem here, showing mastery over, say, Western culture, elements of Western culture, products of a good elite education. So the baguette here, where she talks about you expected to get a baguette. But instead you got cheap bread, right? And this idea of not wanting to appear cheap or tacky, to use her language, which would be to, I think, betray a kind of fresh off the boatness or FOB-ness, right? And of course there are gendered and class dimensions here. And I think that one has to seem grateful, because in many ways for artists and critics and scholars and poets, people have to make their careers. People have to make a living. And there is a cost, there is a price one pays when you don't actually behave properly, right? So I want to really think about that within the context of this poem, but just more generally. And again, let me return to that question of whether a poem or a painting allows one a certain latitude of talking about race or racism, or does it not? I think that's a question we can talk about in the Q&A. And I think the other thing to think about is the idea of gratitude within a colonial or sort of colonial, within colonial structures and ideology, and also the sort of legacy of missionary work, and the idea of what it means to be grateful, to be chosen as a token or whatever, right? And I think that that what's so empowering and what's so amazing about what Marcy and others are doing here at Stanford with this whole project around Asian American art is that they're not really waiting for white critics to notice Asian American artists, they're not, or to pick the one or two that are going to be the favorites, right? And I think it really is going to be up to the BIPOC and Asian American critics and scholars to make it possible that people don't have to be put in this position of just feeling grateful for getting crumbs in general. I mean, but I do think at the same time, echoing Marcy's actually introductory remarks, that we should be very grateful for the people that came before us, the activists and artists and poets and scholars who actually have made this possible, what we're doing now. And that includes the ordinary, the unnamed, the railroad workers, the gardeners, the houseboys, the forgotten. It's not just artists and poets and scholars, but a lot of people, a lot of ordinary people, ordinary in quotes. So I think there is a gratitude there that's a genuine gratitude, a gratitude that's genuine, but I do think that the terms of gratitude in a racialized, hierarchical, racial capitalist society, that gratitude, there's a huge cost. I think that I think there's a lot of desire for that, what she says, towardness, that you want, there's this desire to be accepted. And there's a huge cost to pay for that. So I would say, beware of white love. And I don't mean white love in the romantic sense or the personal or individual sense, but I mean there is a huge price to be paid when you want that acceptance from a larger society or critical elite, frankly. And it's something for us to think about. So I really do want to think about the limits of, and wanting to break those limits or not adhere to those outlining norms. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really such a pleasure to be at this convening and to be here with all of you. Thanks to all of those whose labor, vision, and commitment have brought us together to think together today. That was so exciting. Pragita is a friend of mine, and my friend and myself collaborated on the cover of Under Gloom. So that's a cute connection, so thank you. So the subject of my talk is Sultana's Dream. We were asked to choose one image, and I'm going to be showing you 25 images because my work is a lot about multiplicity and excess. But I am going to be doing it within 10 minutes because I respect your time. So, so let's see. The subject of my talk is Sultana's Dream, which is both a series of relief prints I created and a feminist science fiction novella of the same name written in 1905 over the course of an afternoon that inspired it. The first sentence of the story begins our speculative journey as follows. One evening, I was lounging in an easy chair in my bedroom and thinking lazily of the condition of Indian womanhood. Before I delve into Sultana and her dreaming, I want to take a brief 3-minute detour to talk about how I got here and some of the challenges, convictions, and values that catalyzed this work. So earlier this morning, we were talking about the lacuna that we navigate in order to get here, all of the absences and non-existences that might have brought our own work and our own research into clarity. So we each have our own immigration trajectories, and my parents came after the Act of 1965, but not as professionals through a green card lottery that my father won. He immigrated to Brooklyn in 1972, where I was born, and he spent the rest of his life there until he died in April of 2021. So we were the only people from our family to be living in the US. I spent a lot of time, most summers in India, and so some of my earliest and most profound visual encounters were there. And some of the things I notice about these images, hand-painted Bollywood posters, line drawings made of rice flour, was the site specificity, public engagement, action, joy, and visual excess that formed a textured weave of inspirations that inspired my early works. So these are the kinds of images that I was looking at when I made my work. And this is some of the first work that I made in 22 years ago. And so I was noticing that my work was often misunderstood and misinterpreted from the very get. Frequently, I would be asked if my work was about the plight of Indian women, something that made me realize that most viewers could not think of this figure as anything other than an other, and brought with their gaze onto my work an oppositional set of visual regimes that would provoke such a read, that were steeped in an anthropological or colonial way of looking, where the understanding of a South Asian subject was mostly as an object of knowledge or a candidate for rescue, rather than a universal subject in her own right. This dissonance struck me hard, as do similar disjunctures in our racialization in the West. South Asia and its diasporas constitute 1/4 of humanity, 1/4 of humanity, and this is why it feels disjunctive, to say the least, to be situated ever precariously in the American racial consciousness as well as in racial formations such as Asian American. So I noticed that my painting was read through the lens of images like this and this, rather than images like this or this, which is what was inspiring my work. Subsequent years of illegibility and my disappointment at the persistence of the majoritarian gaze upon my work, my comic works were once described as a lesbian Roy Lichtenstein, included an evolution and a thinking in my work that led me to consider science fiction as our contemporary and preeminent mythic structure of today, asking those same ontological questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What constitutes human? What constitutes justice? So I was interested in relief cuts for this work because of the political valence that often comes with this form, including the works upstairs at the Cantor Center that were made during Japanese incarceration, but also including the works of Emory Douglas and of a printmaker called Chitra Prasad, whose work I'll show you later. So one of the things, two things I love about utopia. One is thinking about what was on the other side of utopia's coins, which led me to some of the research that I'll show you, and also utopia's attention to structures rather than individuals. It is all too common these days for the larger structural violences our Asian American communities are up against to be undercut by the success stories of a few individuals. So among the structures that Rokia Begum talks about in Utopia are a work-life balance, men needing to be protected from public space and being kept indoors. And this is, I'm interspersing this with some of the research that I found because going to different temporalities that are not necessarily connected to ours made me realize the thing I often think about, which is that we've always been here. So thinking about ways that we've always been here and thinking about how those connect to some of the other structures that Rokia Begum talks about, including water storage, structures for water storage, flying cars, an open border policy, women cannot get married before they were 21. All of these structural ideas were part of her utopic story. So part of the work formally also engages structures and technologies outside of our own, including research I did into water storage, into universities in Bangladesh. This is Somapura, but there's another one called Nalanda, which was around from the 5th to the 12th century AD, and was a very important way in which texts came from India to China to inform the development of Chinese Buddhism. And I also did a fellowship at the South Asian American Digital Archive, where I found many more stories, communities, and histories that would be obscured by the kinds of predetermined, overdetermined images that I showed you in the beginning. So among the policies that she talks about is an open border policy, and researching this work during the Muslim ban, but also thinking about September 11th and all of the events that have led up to where we are now that have happened over the last many decades, I was thinking about places and ways in which why there was invisibility for me growing up and realizing that there was a huge period where South Asians just were not immigrating here. But also, not just that, so when I was growing up, there were very few people my age who had been in the US for longer than a few years. But what I did realize is that there were many communities that had come before that time, so including the Sikh Mexican community of Yuba City, California, and the Bengali African American community of Spanish Harlem. So we have always been here. So these are some of the things that I was thinking about while I created this series of works. I found it so amazing to think that Rokia Begum's specificities of her dream are very much in line with how we're thinking today. The opening image is of a woman at rest, contemplating, having a meta dialogue with herself around the category of womanhood. So that in itself is really stunning. So I want to end by saying some of the ways in which I seek to, work with some of these erasures and illegibilities is by dipping into both temporalities and visual languages. I would say dipping is wrong, deep diving into temporalities and visual languages that are don't seem so close to where we are today. So this includes the language of printmaking, the language of album art, and also of comics. Thank you so much. Sultana's Dream has just been republished as a book by Penguin, along with other stories by Rokia Begum. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm so happy to be here.
Hi, I'm John Yao. I want to thank everybody who invited me here, for inviting me here. It's kind of amazing to be in a room with all these people. What I'm reading today is an edited version of the introduction of my forthcoming book, Please Wait by the Coat Room, Reconsiderations of Race and Art. It'll be published by Black Sparrow Press in June of 2023. Wilfredo Lam was born in Sangre La Grande, Cuba in 1902 and died in Paris, France in 1982. His father, Yam Lam, was a Chinese immigrant who cut off his pigtail and refused to be obeisant to the empress. And his mother, Ana Serafina Castilla, was the daughter of a Congolese former slave mother and a biracial Cuban father of African and European ancestry. I first learned of Lam and his racial identity when I was in high school and was elated to discover an artist who was, like me, a biracial Chinese. Although I had only seen a few paintings by Lam in black and white reproduction, I knew that his background must have influenced the choices he made in his art. I also knew that being biracial is complicated. What does it mean when you're not one, but two, and belong nowhere? The erasure of Lam's biracial identity is why, more than 20 years after I first discovered his work, I wrote, Please Wait by the Coat Room, Wilfredo Lam and the Museum of Modern Art, which was published in Arts Magazine in December of 1988. Were it not for Barry Schwabsky, a friend, poet, and the magazine's editor, who was enthusiastically receptive to my proposal, it is doubtful the article would have been published by any other New York art magazine. There's no exhibition of Lam to justify writing about him, and the art world's institutions were long satisfied with their judgment that he was a minor, derivative artist and second-rate surrealist. Responding to these assessments, I detailed in my article how grotesquely the Museum of Modern Art and its curators had distorted Lam by treating him as if he were a white artist following in the steps of Pablo Picasso. A few hours after the issue came out, Barry called me and told me that he had just learned that Lam's large gouache on paper, The Jungle, the focus of my article, had been removed from the wall by the museum's entrance and put in storage. It was as if I had written about a painting that did not exist. Excuse me. It was many years before the painting was seen again near the men's room on the second floor of the new building, designed by Yoshio Taniguchi, pointed out to me by the curator James Mayer, saying, ironically, at least he got to the second floor. The museum's continued segregation of the jungle prevented it from having a dialogue with Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, which I believe was Lam's original intention. They could not accept the possibility that Lam had reappropriated the African gods that Picasso had appropriated at the beginning of the 20th century nor could they entertain the idea that the purpose of his reappropriation was to restore as well as give the gods that Picasso had stolen a domain they could inhabit undisturbed. Such thinking would have to recognize that art was not a purely formal exploration, culminating in Jackson Pollock's poured paintings and the critical assertion that paint was just paint. The reason MoMA could not place Lam's The Jungle near Picasso's Les Demoiselles was because it challenged its hierarchical thinking where all major artists are white. I'm not sure what I thought would happen when the article was published, but it was not this, nor did it stop there. The art world was silent, not only in response to my article, but also to MoMA's swift removal of the painting. Not a single magazine or art writer commented on MoMA's decision. It was as if Lam in the Jungle had never existed, and to a large degree he did not, except perhaps as a footnote to Pablo Picasso. 3 years later, it was wonderfully affirming when my essay was included in the anthology Out There, Marginalization in Contemporary Culture, 1992, and yet to me, the mainstream art world was still not interested in the issues I had raised. I felt like I was talking to myself in a noisy tunnel full of people rushing about because they had more important things on their mind. MoMA's response and the art world's subsequent silence helped deepen my resolve to address the aesthetics of exclusion and the manifold ways it had been maintained like a well-oiled machine. I also knew that I had to be stealthy about it. In order to confront and expose what I felt were widespread omissions and gross misrepresentations, as well as to protect myself, I always tried to remember what the Black curator Lowry Stokes said to me after I got particularly heated in a public discussion. She said, "You have to pick your battles." I had just disagreed with a prominent white art critic who dismissed what I had to say about racial identity with arrogant disdain. I don't think about what color I am when I get up in the morning. I just wash my face and brush my teeth. The contempt in his response was blatant, but the gist of it was not surprising, as I had experienced being brushed aside before and knew that it would happen again. This book chronicles some of the battles that I've chosen to fight, starting with Please Wait by the Coat Room and moving up to articles published more recently. As a poet interested in surrealism and Dada, I was always on the lookout for books on the subject. This is why I picked up the MoMA publication Dada Surrealism in their heritage in 1968, when in the mid-'80s I saw it for sale in a bargain book bin at the Strand bookstore, whose slogan is 18 miles of books. This is where I and many others went to look for remaindered and discounted books, and where I found many rare and out-of-print monographs and catalogs for a low price. It was while reading a description of Lam and his work in Dada, Surrealism, and Heritage that I discovered indisputable proof of what I knew had always been there: the art world's blanket denial of the role of ethnicity that an ethnicity can play in the formation of one's aesthetic choices. In that not so long ago time, quality was all that mattered, and artists were colorless, meaning white. While some of the perceptions have been modified, I believe that artists of color have still not gained parity with white artists who are considered groundbreakers. In order to frame my objection to this hierarchical thinking, I chose to write about MoMA's placement of the jungle on the wall leading to the museum's coat room, hence the title. Even though William Rubin was antagonistic towards surrealism because he did not think it was as formally innovative as Cubism, he organized the exhibition Dada, Surrealism, and Their Heritage from MoMA, paving the way for him to join the museum staff as a permanent curator and promote his formalist agenda. This is the offending entry he wrote about Lam in the exhibition catalog. Wilfredo Lam was the first surrealist to make primitive and ethnic choices central to his art. Rubin erased Lam's ethnicity as well as his familiarity with Yoruba religious practices starting when he was a child, as well as downplayed surrealism's contribution to art. As I dug deeper into the few pieces of critical writing on Lam by American scholars, I discovered that it was very different than what was written about him in Europe. I learned it wasn't just Rubin who rejected Lam's complex heritage, nor was Lam's case an isolated example. Rather, I found that Rubin's cleaving of identity and aesthetics to be a common practice in the American art world. By the standards of objectivity that were widely being used to determine an artwork's quality, Lam was judged to be a derivative white or colorless artist patterning himself after Pablo Picasso. Rubin considered Lam's identity, which was an amalgamation of Asian, European, and African lineages, irrelevant to his art, and he was hardly alone. These so-called objective viewpoints were espoused by Clement Greenberg, Donald Judd, Rosalind Krauss, Hal Foster, and others in high positions of authority. That mindset helped establish, develop, and preserve the rules used to conclude what was groundbreaking and important about avant-garde, especially in New York, and one's racial identity was considered irrelevant to one's art. The subversion of this thinking became my unannounced self-appointed task. I had to find ways to expose the mechanisms that enable the mainstream art world to go blithely along, content that it was examining everything with the same detached, objective eye, while ignoring formative issues such as identity and cultural background. As I wrote about artists as racially and culturally diverse as Ruth Ozawa, Richard Hunt, James Luna, Jiha Moon, Nadia Haji Umar, and Carrie James Marshall, I repeatedly realized how complicated and nuanced identity can be, particularly in the way the artist manifests it in art. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to studying the work of these artists, as exemplified by the various strains of formalist and Marxist criticism that for a long time dominated the art world's assessment. Just as each artist's work calls for a germane response, writing about a body of work meant you had to see what they were doing with your own eyes as well as through their eyes, unguided by the marketplace or the opinion of others. By writing about the work of artists of different ethnicities and cultures, I came to realize that race was not monolithic and that identity was not a fixed and reductive form, however much the art world might wish it were so. Rather, identity was something that was constantly changing, at least in the artists I chose to write about, perhaps because a significant number of them were biracial. They experienced the world through the overlapping yet distinct lenses of their multiple legacies and histories. The art world, like the larger world it is part of, is not made up of only black and white artists. When Carrie James Marshall stated, "One of the reasons I paint black people is because I'm a black person. There are fewer representations of black figures in the historical record," he made a point that I want to expand upon. Isn't Marshall's statement also applicable to artists of other colors, races, and ethnicities living in America? Doesn't it also apply to biracial artists? Haven't these artists also been waiting by the coat room, denied full entry by museums and other art world institutions? It is this world of closed doors which I and many others have lived in and worked with our entire lives that I've tried to address in the essays that I selected for this book. I moved to New York in the mid-1970s, and began to write about art shortly afterwards, the only Asian American to be writing for Art in America. For years, I was allowed only to write about artists that no one else wanted to write about. This was the first glass ceiling that I was aware of encountering in the world. Lowry Sims said there would be more. Despite this and other obstacles, I realized that in order to push back against the art world's blindness about race, ethnicity, and non-white cultures, I had to begin dissembling the structures of thinking and seeing that were in place. I knew that I had to begin, quote, collecting my own stories, end quote, before they were further ignored or erased. As Amy Fung writes in her book, "Before I was a critic, I was a human being," which I review in this collection. What I took Fung to mean by stories was that you had to learn to listen to others and to hear what they had to say. It also meant you had to start fresh and learn to see through your own eyes. This book is a record of my repeated attempts to do what all people, including art critics, should do: look for themselves and see what is actually there. Thanks.
So first want to say thank Marcy and all the staff for organizing this really phenomenal conference, and I'm really honored to be speaking with everyone today.
I just came to get my glasses.
Glasses, get your phone. And so just before I begin, just a reminder to panelists, I'll open up to see if you all have any questions or comments for each other, so have that brewing. And for everyone else here, feel free to write questions on the little note cards, just to have those things coming up. So in focusing on race and aesthetics, one must certainly grapple with representation. It's a word that's been repeated here. For example, how we show race in our artwork is about the politics of representation. And if race is abstracted or literal, figurative, this becomes a representational choice. I figure it's important to place pressure here today when talking about race and aesthetics on the idea of representation. Particularly, it has become a presumed good and something we are perhaps invested in. The standard for this discussion for me is Gayatri Spivak's canonical essays, Can the Subaltern Speak? In the essay, she delineates between two theories of representation, Darstellung and Wertschätzung. One form of representation is what she calls the staging of the world and the scene of writing, or what we might call aesthetic representation. While the other form is political representation, which involves those proxies that come to represent the other for a larger public. The setup here in thinking about race and aesthetics is that it is about both the medium of expression, aesthetic representation, that represents what we know as Asian American art, along with the people who come to represent what Asian American art is and who it belongs to, political representation. These approaches have been taken up by those working in Asian American aesthetics, and I'm going to, please forgive me now, what I'm going to do in about the next 3 minutes of the 10 minutes that I have is do a full run through of Asian American approaches to representation. So it's going to be messy. It's also hard to do this considering the kind of powerhouse intellectuals in this room, but I'll try, just very briefly. In brief, representation has been expanded first at the level of who comes to represent Asian America. We see this in calls for the expansion of Asian America in what I would call the cardinal directions. Not just those from East Asia, but also West Asia, in solidarity, particularly post-9/11 forms of Middle Eastern racialization, and South Asia and Southeast Asia. We've also witnessed this by expanding Asian American subjects beyond masculinist and respectable norms, which is why queer, feminist, trans, disability, and sex-positive approaches have been so critical. Although we might slip into debates over good versus bad or proper versus improper representations, we've provided space to move beyond such debates to expand who becomes to be represented in our art. And I think critically here, Chitra Ganesh's talk helps us consider the limits of racial categorization itself and what it might include in terms of utopic dreaming, structural landscapes, political hope amidst inequality. This expansion of political representation has also occurred in calls to transnationalize, as both John Yao and Victoria Sung show. They both highlight key spaces like the Caribbean and Africa that expand political representation. Further, Yao and Sung placed together the need to attend to institutions, with Yao reminding us of William Rubin's career at MoMA with the contentious 1984 Primitivism show, and with Sung bringing us to the Havana Biennial. Their talks highlight the ethics of what it means to speak not about another, but also how we need to speak nearby and next to then echo again Chenmin Ha, expanding beyond discourses of appropriation. But most critically, these two presentations remind us that it isn't just about talking about the other for individual critics and artists, but also within institutional spaces. And I'll put more pressure on institutions and structures. In addition, we've seen calls to expand this idea of representation in terms of aesthetic mediums. Dorothy Wang today provides a critical expansion into not only poetry, but also the forms and acceptable tones that are allowed in aesthetic and political expression. I find that this attention to tone important as a way to consider what polices the boundaries of appropriate critique. Can we be embittered rather than gracious citizen subjects? And how might this push aesthetic representation itself? Further, the field has also asked us to shift away from depictions of the body to consider many Asian American artists' explorations of abstraction, and also turn to historical objects and commodities like the work of Candice Lin or Annika Yi. And in fact, we see this reworking of aesthetic representation and political representation in the organization of this forum, the panels tomorrow on gender sexuality, alongside the transnational as it relates to global intimacies and questions of historical memory, help us rethink political representation, who counts and comes to be represented, and the panels on what counts as and how we produce institutional critique, and to rethinking the bounds of what counts as legibly political or activist, or not, further the work of expanding aesthetic representation. I walk through this large terrain to create an admittedly overly broad map. I do so because the world continues to ask for more representation. I don't stand against this project of expanding representation, and there will always be academic trends that inform this, more communities that have been less known that force us to add to this project. In other words, the demand for representation will possibly never end. I'm instead more interested in thinking about representation less as an unmediated good, but more as a condition produced by, demanded by, and benefiting the institutions we are all part of and critique. There's a structural demand that I want to place pressure on when it comes to the logic of increasing representation or making representation matter. I say this because even when or if we become enfolded into the university, curricula, museums, or the art market, we might be represented, but we will also most likely be discussed in limited ways and displayed aside like the quote room. So where do we go from here, and what do we do with the broad landscape related to Asian American representation? I'll leave us with 2 points. First, how can we shift from presuming representation to be an unstated good towards a structural demand? Institutions have shifted the welcome representation, but have not changed how they are structured, how they are funded and who its leaders are, and even if boards and leadership slowly diversify, how can we demand that we change how they operate beyond its usual ways and through its metrics around merit? Rather than only producing more representation, how might we highlight the conditions that maintain representation as an institutional demand that reproduces and maintains structural inequality? Second, in invoking Spivak, I want to stress that her focus on the subaltern is not simply a call to represent all forms of minoritarian existence. Her Marxist politic is important here, as her essay is attuned to the international divisions of labor, capital, and those subalterns that are not part of a global consumer class. She writes, quote, "Here are the subsistence farmers, unorganized peasant labor, the tribals, and the communities of zero workers on the street or in the countryside. To confront them is not to represent them, but to learn to represent ourselves," end quote. In our fervor for representation, we might eventually arrive at representing workers that are illegible within a consumerism that saturates global capital, and here, Asia is such a critical space, considering it is both for rampant global consumption and consumerism, but also a site of the production and extraction of workers, primarily women. Most critically, from Spivak, we learned that we need to remember that representing others is a task that forces us to grapple with how we represent ourselves. Representation, in other words, is both a structural demand and indicative of our own politics and ethics. What I appreciate in what has been presented today is how representation of race through aesthetics enacts this version of a structural and ethics-based representation. For Yao, Lam doesn't seek to represent the true realities of his heritage. Instead, he reorders a dominant discourse by the likes of Picasso and others that take primitivism as mere inspiration rather than as epistemology. For Sung, Abad uses representation to place one in conversation with others beyond one's own self. Representation here has an ethics that does not dare speak for another, but rather engages and places one in conversation with. I find such an approach so refreshing and important, especially for the task of curation. For Ganesh, the utopic imaginary extends representation to think through the metaphysical. Her luscious work considers the limits of representation and to exceed its limits in the everyday. And for Wang, the tone of Sharma's words do not seek to simply represent the self, but highlight the institutional demands placed upon the other. Feelings arise from institutions. None of us here have the answer, but collectively, these presenters can each be seen as attempts toward pushing representation away from simply a call to be seen. I say this because there is often talk about how we each feel a responsibility for or a burden of representation when it comes to working in institutions. I find this so important to hold on to, but I also want us to have permission to see this beyond an individualized responsibility and rather as a collective task. Representation is also a collective exercise, an exercise that forces us to account for ourselves in the act of representation. So I'll end here with some questions for the panelists, and please do feel free to ask each other questions as well as we open up. And as a reminder, if you all have questions, feel free to write them down. First are the questions for each other, and I think second for me, with whom do you see yourself working collectively with to grapple with the task and burden of representation? So to sort of do the work of what it does mean to singularize beyond just yourself with your work, but who do you see yourself working in conversation with and collectively with? So thank you so much for your presentations, and I look forward to talking with you. So we can open up to the panelists to see if there's any questions for each other.
Does this work?
Yep.
Yes.
The thing about collective is I work for the online magazine Hyperallergic, which is run by Harag Vartanian, and he's made it a point to mentor as many writers of color as he can find, Seth Rodney and others who've gone on to have jobs at other places. So I feel like that's my collective. And Harag and I probably meet once a week. We don't agree. We agree to disagree, but I think that's also important, that we don't all have to think alike. So, I mean, I think that's been a really important part of my life for the last decade, is just to have this ongoing conversation about that subject of collectivity. Well, that's my answer.
I guess, yeah, I would say also, in addition to, other, scholars and thinkers, writers, I think artists are, key collective partners or people to think about in a collective. And in particular, I'm thinking about this notion, I think it's Alain de Souza who said, artists can help really concretize theory, and in their making, they can really kind of maybe, as you were saying, like matter, in terms of like the actual making of matter, help realize kind of this visioning or theory. So I think artists are so key, especially as a curator, working with artists as part of a collective, and being, a sounding board or being part of a certain brain trust is a very important thing to think about.
I would say I'm a scholar, so I'm in the academy. I'm in an American Studies program, but I was trained in the English department. But actually, my interlocutors and my collective are mainly creative writers, and not so much scholars. So mostly poets and fiction writers of BIPOC fiction writers and poets, because I think one of the difficulties with thinking through race and aesthetics in English departments, which is, of course, English departments are a function of British colonialism, right? We know that. They're sort of waning, but they're not waning enough right now. So I think part of the problem is that there's a lot of resistance within, even though you have this question of representation, Hentyle, which I totally agree that I'm not interested in I mean, I'm interested to a certain extent, but that's not the main problem. That if you put in a few Asian American or African American or Indigenous or Latinx writers in a curriculum, that's not sufficient. Because basically the very basis, the foundational basis and principles and concepts and criteria of English studies, of English literary studies, is colonial and is totally racially infused. So you can't just deal with the question of like token representation. So I do find that actually speaking to scholars, I find less interesting than speaking to creative writers and artists, frankly.
I would say it's my collaborators and interlocutors it's very broad. One person that I've had the pleasure and honor to think with for a long period of time is Mariam Ghani, with whom I've done a collaborative project called Index of the Disappeared. But I also think with my friends who are not artists. For example, my friend who is the director of racial justice at the ACLU, my friend who is a Bhangra DJ, and other friends in the larger queer Asian community, my students, colleagues from Skowhegan, such as Byron Kim and Anoka Faruqi. So it's happily very, very broad, and I'm really appreciative of that.
Yeah, I know one of the things that Marcy Kwan was really aiming for and bringing us all together in conversation is that it's not just sort of only artists or only academics, but I think it's really quite fruitful. I am also of the mindset that I really just love talking to artists usually, and not so much my colleagues. And I love my colleagues, and but there is something about, and I think Dorothy, you're bringing this up in terms of what is it about is it something about the medium itself that provides space to say the things that you cannot say? Is there space for tone, embitterness, anger, ingratitude, whatever the word is? Is there space to do that in the aesthetic medium that's differentiated from sort of other ways of doing things, or especially in terms of academic work? So I always thought that was like such a helpful thing to work through. So it's I'm wary of always glorifying the aesthetic, but there's something there about art practice itself and having those conversations with artists that provide space to sort of get out of the kind of routinized ways we do that. And I'm sure artists will say the same things even with themselves, right? That maybe it's great to have conversations well outside of artists, but it's always wonderful to have this sort of cross-disciplinary conversations to sort of think through these questions. But one of the things that I think came across in all of everyone's sort of talking points is exhaustion, right? Fatigue. And it's an exhaustion with institutional protocols. It's an exhaustion with kind of structural survival. So maybe we can sort of think through that, and it could be through like utopic lingerings. Like, what does that provide as space as a kind of flight? It could be around just the task of writing, but what are the sort of methods and approaches or things that you all work through in thinking through exhaustion? Because I felt like that was something that sort of came in, or the fatigue of routinized narratives.
I'm 72. I don't feel exhausted at all.
You're much better than me.
I'm really excited. So one of the great things about working for Hyperallergic was when I talked to Hrog, I said, so I've worked for all these magazines, and this is what I want if I write for you. I want to write about any artist, whether they have a gallery or not. I want to just write about whatever I see. And it doesn't have to do with the marketplace. And he said, you can write about whatever you want. I was it. I mean, then I realized I was freer than I'd ever been. Because really for Art in America, because I was hired, John Ashby got me the job. I was like the poet. Oh, he must be sleeping with John because that's the only reason John would recommend him. And then the editor never let me write about anybody that I wanted to, only about people no one else would look at, write about. And then I realized, make this a positive. There are all these artists that no one's looking at. Maybe there's something there. And suddenly all these different things happened because of that. So I realized, oh, the art world is not what you read in the New York Times, right? It's not Roberta Smith. It's not all that stuff, but that's what people believe. And that's where I learned, right? I learned it through a negative, but I realized if I made it positive, I would, A, not hate myself, and B, be able to do something. So that's what happened. So I'm still excited because when I first wrote for Art in America, there was no Asian American writing in the art world at all that I knew of. And that was just really like, you were just living in, you were just like some weird, and I write about this, I was also mistaken over and over for the artist David Diao. So people would say, hi, David, and David later said that some people actually said, hi, John, to him. We do not look alike. We're not even near the same age. I mean, he was a teacher when I was a student, you know, I mean, huh? So things change.
Yeah. So maybe to rephrase the question then is, how do you take a negative and think about it in ways that allow it to be more productive for you? Like how, you know, I mean, I'm struggling with this. How do you flourish, right? And how do you kind of create space for yourself to think through and work not just with critique, but through other modes that open up space for you? So thanks for that. Chitra.
I think one way is to have moments where you can reflect on things that have happened. So hearing John's talk was great because I used to work on the floor of the MoMA as a museum educator for 4 years. And at that time, Lamb's painting had been upgraded to being on the 5th floor. And it was across from Demoiselle, and I did teach them together. So that is amazing to me to hear sort of the backstory of that work. I think I get excited about my students and about all the things that are seeming possible now that were not possible before. I get also excited to see how this is a moment for, I mean, I agree that there is the problematic of representation as inextricable from a market. So whether that's for an underwear ad or for, you know, BIPOC art, there's a market there that is undergirding it. But I get excited to see how certain artworks are being excavated from the past and given the light of day. Like there was recently a Cheng Ho Chung exhibition, and the first time I had encountered his work, it was actually on a jigsaw puzzle. Like I bought a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of something I loved, and it was his work. And then I was like, oh, he even had a New York Times obituary. Like, who is this? And now, you know, 10 years later, there's an exhibition. So I think sort of just trying to keep my eyes open.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I just wanted, so in answer to your question, Hentyle, there's actually, I have two sort of responses that are linked. One is that I am heartened that, for example, in Asian American poetry, there's so many people writing now at such high levels and so experimental, and not just experimental, just a variety of aesthetic styles. Because I actually discovered John's work by accident 30 years ago in Berkeley, walking into East Wind bookstore and just seeing his books. I'd never heard of you, John. And it was purely by chance. You know, it was like, who's this person who's published all these books, right? And then I ended up writing on John. But I think this is really testament to the work of lots and lots of people who've made the study of Asian American and ethnic studies, of ethnic literature and art possible in the Academy. And the Academy has a lot of problems, obviously. I'm very critical of it, but it's a very powerful space, right? So the fact that a lot of people, not only in the Academy, but outside of it, actually put their bodies on the line and suffered to make that possible. So now we do have all these people writing. And I think with John's work, you know, Margie Pearl thought you were Polish, right? And you were sort of dismissed as one of a group of post-New York School poets. And I would argue to a great extent that John's visibility now has a lot to do with Asian American scholars. That not only that, you've done a lot in the art world too, John, but certainly in poetry, Asian American scholars have written about him. And he's deservedly now recognized, and that's true for many Asian American poets and other writers. But, you know, it was a hard slog. It was not easy. And I say today that even in most departments of English, there's like one Asian American, if at all. So I really want to acknowledge that that's been very difficult for decades. But again, exciting for me to see. I mean, I was doing an interview with Monica Yoon recently, and I was thinking, I'd seen Monica's name in a literary magazine from Oxford, and it was like, you know, I used to just look for the names of an Asian person, of a poet. Literally, you know, you would just scour anywhere and be so excited when you saw an Asian. You don't do that anymore. There are too many people writing. That's wonderful, right? But I will say that in the Academy, I think that the people I've seen that have really carried the burden or had a really tough time when you talk about exhaustion are women of color. And really a sort of physical price and a mental price. And it's been, from what I've seen, you know, people, and I'm sure men of color too and other people, but really women of color. And I would say one of the things that's helped me has been to take that kind of anger about a kind of structural inequality and a kind of experiential inequality and take that anger and actually do something with it. So I think the intro to my book was just really propelled by anger and how I had been treated in English departments as a woman of color since graduate school. It's really hard to convert that anger into something more productive, but I think it's the only way to really survive.
I have one more thing along these lines, is an actual thing I do besides feel great when good things are happening is try to really align myself and spend time with people who actually share my values and my ethics, because I think everybody is not in the place for the same reason. And so finding the people, I think, has been helpful.
I think instead of saying embittered, Sian and I did the book Ugly Feelings, and she was a student of mine at Brown, and we talked about the notion of ugly feelings, like could you get that into work? And she felt that was something I tried to do, is to get that into my work. So, because it's the kind of feeling you don't want to admit that you have, but you know you have them. So, you know, it's repressive to yourself to not figure out a way to frame it, get it out there, you know. It means 20 more years of therapy rather than 10. So I figured 10 would be enough.
And I like relishing in the negative. Like I relish in being bitter and cynical. So this is not to stigmatize that. This is not like a happiness forum where you need to feel good about yourself. But to actually to think about ugly feelings is not to expel them, but rather to think with and through everything else, right? And I think that's the complexity that we're all working through. Victoria, I wanted to give you a little space if you want to answer.
I wanted to follow up, I guess, on what all three of you have been saying, and Dorothy, you were talking about this slog, and I think it is so important to emphasize and to recognize all of that labor and effort, you know, that has gone into taking us to where, or bringing us to where we are today. And, you know, I talked about Pasita Abad earlier. My research has been only about 3 years into her practice, but Pasita Abad was an artist who worked for decades, and for decades her work was not taken seriously. If you read the reviews, you know, whatever reviews exist of her work, her work was not critically assessed. And I think artists of color who, you know, often don't have that critical reception, then their work is, you know, relegated to the footnotes or just written out of the art historical record altogether. Yeah. And so I think one thing that I think is really great is in the early 2000s, In this book, Fresh Talk, Daring Gazes, that some of you may know, that was edited by Margot Machida, Sharon Mazzotta, and Elaine Kim, they invited Faith Ringgold to actually write a little blurb about Pasita Abad. And this is, 2003, I think. And Faith Ringgold has this incredible, line where she says, Pasita Abad is a testament to women artists of color who are working everywhere and are super creative but are not being recognized. And she ends and says something like, all of us have to get ready, because the time is going to come when people start to actually appreciate what she is doing. That was 20 years ago. Only now is her work really coming into kind of a broader consciousness. So I think, again, it's so important to underline all of that, effort that has gone into where we are today.
Yeah. And that was one of the things that I've been sort of really touched by. We had a morning session with a lot of the speakers today, and this morning, the thing that kind of dawned on me was the energy of decolonial movements, not how we talk about decolonization now, but decolonial movements that were happening in the early part of the 20th century, mid-20th century, third world movements. That energy produced a different kind of work. And we have all this kind of, I call it like the hangover of post-essentialist discourse. Like we have all this critique, but there's something so vibrant about that moment, which isn't to fetishize the 60s and say it's never going to be as good as that, but to really think about the material conditions of existing in that moment, a possibility, of the overthrowing of colonial powers, of the activity that was going on in the Bay Area and well beyond, that I was kind of reminded of this morning, and with many of the speakers I was so thankful to feel. But it was something that I think Dorothy for kind of reminding us of like I'm both critical of representation, but I'm also cannot not do it, right? I am deeply indebted to it, but I'm also skeptical of it. And I don't yet know how to fully articulate that. And what I do appreciate about just being here today with all of you is we're struggling with that together. And I do appreciate all of us thinking together in that way. So maybe just to keep us on the choo-choo train of time, I want to thank the panelists for everything and for everyone for coming in. And I believe we have a short break. Marcy, do you want to start right at 4:30 or? We're starting the next panel now. Okay. So we are starting the next panel now. Thank you, everyone.